Andrew Kehoe was born on the 1st of February in 1872. 55 years later, he would commit what many consider to be the first school massacre in the United States. Whether or not this latter statement is true, the one undeniable fact is the monstrosity of his crime and the dozens of dead children that he left behind. Greed and narcissism are just two of the major factors that led to this tragedy. 44 people were killed, 38 of whom were children. Many people believe, however, that Andrew was a murderer long before the school massacre. As a young man, Andrew was incredibly intelligent and he spent his college years studying electrical engineering. But when he was 18, tragedy struck, as that's when his beloved mother had died, and his father very quickly remarried a teenager by the name of Frances Wilder. This rapid replacement of his mother pissed Andrew off. He hated his stepmother, and he was not afraid to let her know this. It wasn't until 20 years later, when Andrew was in his 40s, that another tragedy would hit the family. Frances was in her kitchen preparing to turn on the stove when it suddenly exploded. Her entire body caught flame as she screamed from the unbearable agony. Frances did not survive. There was, however, one person present who had witnessed the so-called accident. This witness hated Frances, but they also had the electrical and mechanical skills to tamper with the stove. That person was Andrew. Fast forward to 1919, Andrew and his wife Nellie Price have moved to Bath Township, Michigan. They have bought a farm from Nellie's aunt for over $12,000, which is equivalent to over $300,000 today. Andrew made an immediate impression upon his community. He was described as being incredibly ambitious and hardworking. He could be seen working day and night on his farm and would even assist his neighbors on their property. And yet, on the other hand, it did not take long for his neighbors to suffer from the wrath of his violent and horrific temper. Andrew once shot and killed his neighbor's dog because he had entered his property unannounced. On another occasion, neighbors watched in horror as Andrew beat his own horse to death for the simple fact that it refused to obey his direction. By the early 1920s, the town of Bath had decided to construct the Bath Consolidated School District. This decision was highly controversial, as it meant that the sustainment of the school would now rely primarily, if not exclusively, on taxes. This meant that landowners, like Andrew, would now have to pay a higher value in property taxes. To put this in perspective, by 1922, Andrew was paying over $2,000 in property taxes. Just 4 years later, that number would skyrocket to over $3,000. Andrew had real love and affection for money, and he saw these new taxation rules as cruel and unfair. And it's for that very reason that he decided to run for the position as a school trustee. And despite his dog-killing ways, he was actually given that position. Andrew might have been a cold-hearted, horse-killing man, but he was highly intelligent and well-regarded when it came to the handling of money. As a new trustee, Andrew could oversee, and at times even dictate, the ways in which the school's finances were being distributed. And in every town meeting, Andrew would always bring up the topic of taxes, demanding that they be lowered or eradicated altogether. Andrew did not care for the school or the children. The betterment and financial elevation of the town was of no interest to him. Many people, of course, disagreed with Andrew, but whenever they would bring up legitimate concerns or even voice their opinions, they would be horrifically verbally abused by Andrew. The town meetings will always end up in a screaming match, with Andrew doing all the screaming and the townsfolk just sitting there and taking it. Looking back, however, it's now easy to see why Andrew was so desperate to eliminate his responsibilities as a tax-paying member of his town. By 1926, Andrew was in deep financial trouble. He could no longer afford to pay the mortgage on his house, and his aunt-in-law, who had sold him the farmhouse, was preparing to foreclose on his property. To make matters worse, Andrew's wife, Nellie, was sick with tuberculosis, and she was constantly going in and out of the hospital, which was only adding to their building debt. In the early months of 1926, Andrew was promoted to town clerk, and he held on desperately to this position. His life was in shambles in every other area. It was only the power he held in the school system and within the town that gave him a sense of structure and meaning. But by this point, the people of Bath were weary of Andrew's unreasonable temper, which is why in April of 1926, Andrew was stripped of his position of town clerk in a very public vote. The message was now loud and clear. Andrew wasn't wanted. He was a nuisance, a sick man that no one wanted around themselves, and especially around their children. But a man who beats his horse to death does not take a public loss so lightly. Andrew felt like the town were ungrateful for all of his hard work and brilliant future plans. The townsfolk were an ungrateful community that needed to be taught a lesson. After several months of isolation, Andrew started making frequent trips to town, shopping at a myriad of different stores, but he would always purchase the same item. That item was dynamites. Neighbors would often hear explosives going off in Andrew's property, a lot more than what was normal, to the point where they would nickname him the Dynamite Farmer. Despite being kicked out of the school board, the school district continued to grant Andrew access to the school, so much so that they even went as far as to give him a key so he could enter the premises whenever he pleased. The school was still relatively new, and it needed a lot of repairs, and who better to do those repairs than Andrew, who would spend most of his life as an electrician. But Andrew would use this trust to sneak explosives into the school buildings at all hours of the night. On the 16th of May of 1927, Andrew's wife Nellie was dismissed from the hospital for the last time. She arrived home and found her husband waiting for her. Andrew killed her and dumped her body in a wheelbarrow. 2 days later, at 8:45 a.m., Andrew detonated dynamite inside of his farmhouse. A large chunk of his farmhouse was blown to pieces as a raging fire threatened to devour the property. Neighbors ran to Andrew's farmhouse, and despite the raging fire, they broke inside, desperately looking to rescue him. But suddenly, Andrew appeared in his truck, driving away from his farmhouse. He looked at his neighbors and gleefully told them to stop what they were doing and that they should make their way toward the school. What the neighbors did not know was that the same moment that Andrew detonated the bombs in his house was the same moment he detonated the bombs he had scattered throughout the school building. The north wing of the school was destroyed instantly. Rescuers who were making their way toward Andrew's burning farmhouse turned their vehicles around and made their way to the school instead. Hundreds of parents ran to the burning building as they watched it collapse to the floor. What was once a place of peace and safety now reflected a war zone, with the brains and limbs of children scattered everywhere. A teacher who had survived this tragedy told reporters that as the bombs went off, she watched in horror as her students were slowly lifted off the ground and splattered across the classroom. The explosion was so grand that some of her students were thrown out the window. Despite the chaos he had created, Andrew was not done with his destruction. He drove to the school with more dynamite in his truck. When he spotted the superintendent, he took out his gun, but the superintendent fought back. Recognizing that he would lose his physical match, Andrew gave in and detonated the dynamite in the back of his truck. This caused further destruction, killing Andrew, the superintendent, and an 8-year-old boy who had survived the initial school bombing. The community of Bath banded together during this tragedy to help ease the agony and to assist those that needed it. Telephone operators remained at the station for hours in order to summon doctors and hospital workers. Pharmacists turned their stores into triage centers, and dozens of residents worked on the wreckage throughout the entire night in the hopes of unearthing children who were still buried underneath the rubble. After the fire was finally put out, police investigated what was left of the school building. They discovered more explosives that had failed to go off. It was determined that Andrew's original plan was to destroy the entire school building. When police entered what remained of Andrew's property, they made 2 disturbing discoveries. The first was the value of Andrew's property. They determined that had Andrew just sold off some of his property, he would have had more than enough money to pay off his mortgage. The second discovery was Andrew's final message to the world. A wooden board was wired around the farm's fence with a message inscribed on it. The message read, "Criminals are made, not born."